Hey guys, Dr. Mike Israetel here for RP Plus and RPU, the first lecture of the course on fundamental training principles that guide all training program design. So this course is Introduction to the Training Principles, just to give you guys kind of a grand tour of what this super in-depth course is going to be talking about. Lots of lectures, pushing about 10 lectures in this course, and we're going to be getting really into depth. This video, just kind of an introduction as to where we're going to be headed. So we're going to talk about what this course is about. We're going to talk about why it's important to have this course in our curriculum, and it's super important. It's going to become very apparent to you why it's so important. We're going to go through each one of the major training principles, just give you a quick brief description so you're not going in blind, because a lot of the other lectures will go principle by principle. Each principle gets one lecture of its own. So you guys are going to kind of get a feel for, okay, what are we getting into as far as what the training principles really are? And we're going to talk a little bit about how the principles rank compared to each other, because it turns out they're not all of equivalent importance to training program design. It's got to be very clear about which ones are super important, which ones are pretty important, which ones maybe are just details for more advanced athletes to focus on. And lastly, we're going to be closing it off with a discussion of how periodization plays into this whole process. So first of all, what is this course about? It's about the most fundamental basic principles of training. And these principles are derived from the subjects that feed into this higher level of course. So the principles are all derived from sport physiology, from biomechanics, from motor behavior, all of the basics about human bodies and how they operate in the framework of exercise and training. That information is what leads us to derive the training principles. The training principles weren't so much made up as they were discovered based on how bodies actually respond to the training process and respond better and or worse depending on our goals. Really cool thing about the training principles is that the ones we'll be listing for you, the fundamental training principles, of which by our count there are 7, but there's room for interpretation as there could be more, fewer, depending on if you include sub-principles. Basically, with any kind of interpretation, it's about 10 basic ideas about how training works. And here's the cool thing. They apply to every single sport. There is not a single sport or a physical ability. Like lifting weights at the gym to try to get bigger isn't a sport. I mean, there's bodybuilding, but you might not be into that. Just running to improve your cardiovascular fitness isn't really a sport. You're just on the treadmill at the gym. Anytime you try to improve anything with regard to physical ability, whether it's a formal sport or not, it is governed entirely by these training principles. So if you learn them well, that will allow you to fundamentally be at home looking at any training program for any sport. And it allow you to whatever sport or whatever ability you want to get better at training or at evaluating training, you'll be able to do that no matter what the sport is, no matter what the goal is, etc. So the training principles are really kind of guides that will give your training a couple of very dependable features if you apply them to your training program design. They will make your training more effective in the shorter term, weeks to months. Absolutely. They'll make sure you're checking the boxes to keep your training very effective. They'll make it safer both in the short term, so you don't do anything stupid and get hurt within the next weeks or months, and in the long term, especially over months and years of training, if you properly apply the principles, especially a few of them we're going to get into later, it keeps you safe and healthy so you can continue to train hard and make gains well into several years from the point at which you learn about them. And another really cool thing that's sort of underestimated power of applying the training principles is that it makes your training more predictable. So if you hit a plateau, there's less mystery about why you hit the plateau, and there are a couple of easy recourses to very likely solutions as opposed to just being like, well, I'm not making gains and I have no idea why. And it makes your training predictable insofar as when you want to be your best, when you want to show off your best current ability, then you can go through a peaking process designed by these principles to be your best when you need to, and not a day or two or a week or two before or after. For example, if you have an important competition or you want to look good for a wedding, or for an anniversary, or for a vacation. It doesn't even have to be a sport. When you are your best matters. Right? If you're your best 3 weeks after the cruise, well, the photos say, that you were in okay shape, but really you were in great shape, just mistimed it. What about a competition? If you hit all your PRs in a powerlifting lifts, squat, bench press, deadlift 3 weeks after the meet, or even 2 days after the meet, nobody cares, because the meet is where the competition comes. That's what really matters. So using the fundamental training principles is great because it not only makes you better and keeps you safer, it can allow you to time when exactly is you want to show off the best of your current ability. And of course, the ultimate reason why these principles are important, it makes your training more effective in the long term. And we know that the real big meaningful improvements, whether it be to physique or strength or endurance or any other technical quality that you have, is in the long term. So these principles, by allowing you to improve primarily in the long term and set that roadmap for you, that's where they pay their biggest dividends. And that's what this course is about. And I guess we sort of answer this question to a large extent, but there's much more to say. Why are the training principles important? Why is it important to learn this? Well, they're not just kind of descriptions of stuff. They hint at a much deeper physiology, the rules, sort of on average, ways in which our bodies fundamentally operate. Because they have distilled our body's operation into a set of dependable principles, they're basically roadmaps for changing our bodies how we want. Once you understand the operation of a physical system and the sort of average rules or ways in which it works, you can start to modify in strategic places to get more of what you want out of it. Does that mean you can get anything you want out of it? No. But does it mean you can get the most out of it, that that system is willing to bend for you? Absolutely. Right? So, if you're navigating through a city without a map and you have to, let's say, get across New York City from New Jersey to Brooklyn, you have to get across Manhattan, you don't have a map or your GPS doesn't work, then how long is it going to take you? Good God, who knows? You may never get out, right? If you have a map or GPS that tells you where you're going and how to get there, holy crap, that is awesome because it saves you a ton of time and a ton of frustration. It makes your journey rather predictable. Now, what it doesn't do, and this is a very good analogy, I think, is if you have a map or a GPS system that doesn't magically get you from New Jersey to Brooklyn in 30 seconds, that's just not possible unless you have a rocket or something like that. So if you're still driving a car, you're still bound to the rules of the road, but at least you can pick the roads which have the fewest cars on them, or GPS can do that for you. At least you can use the roads with the fastest speed limits. At least you may be able to use the bridges that are in the right locations to cross where you want instead of 10 miles up the road where there's another bridge that crosses over. So within the confines, within the rules of the system, which is what the training principles really are, you operate to the best of your ability. Now, if there's a lot of traffic that day, if you happen to be crossing Manhattan on the 4th of July, right, or on Labor Day, is that a really bad idea? Totally. But no matter what situation you're in, kind of an analogy for what kind of genetics you have or how much you have to work and how much fatigue your job gives you and interferes with training, you can use the training principles to make the best out of that situation. So they're not a guide to infinite gains. They're a guide to the best gains you can have given your circumstances. Just like a map or a GPS system is a guide to the best way to get where you're going given the circumstances. So in the long term is where these things really pay off, right? If you train sort of at random, in the short term, you might get some good gains. But in the long term, these things pay off because they continue to have or sort of a resensitization method to keep getting new gains. And if you follow training designed by the principles, you're least likely to get hurt, which is a big deal about long-term gains. And of course, good for its own thing. I don't think anyone likes getting hurt. And they apply to all sports and physical attributes. So once you learn these training principles, when you go to one of our future courses or more advanced courses like how to design a powerlifting program, we can just speak to you with reference to this is why and because of the principle of overload, and we don't have to explain to you the principle of overload, and because you know that principle, you're going to understand exactly what we're talking about right away. It's a guidebook, it's a code book to understand the language of training, and when you know that code, and you will after this course, you're going to speak the language of training to everyone, you're going to understand it, you're going to be able to consume and interpret training-related information better and faster and more completely with better results than you ever thought was possible prior to learning these principles. Here's the thing. If you're not writing your own programs, no big deal. If you're just a consumer of programs, you purchase them in some way or another, either by buying coaching or buying templates or buying a program online or something like that, our principles are still super important because they're basically like a shopper's guide. If a program that you look at violates some of the very major ones that have a big influence on how much gain you make, probably not a good idea to do that program. But if a program checks the list of pretty good principles and applies to most of them, then you're probably off to a pretty good start, and the details might be something that you're more concerned with or leave up to your coach. Now, if you want to get your best, or if you want to help others out through coaching or through personal training or what have you, then these basic concepts do exactly that, and your knowledge of them is going to take you very, very far. Real quick, let's overview each one of the principles coming up and just talk really basically. This is the shortest definition you'll ever see. How short is it? Well, I'll put it to you this way. It'll take 1 or 2 minutes per principle today for me to define them for you. And in future lectures, each one of these gets its own lecture, something between 30 minutes and an hour and 15 long per principle. There's a lot to say here, a lot. And notice, what is a lot to say is just about the structure of the principle. We're not even getting specific on exactly how to apply them to every single sport or even to one sport in this course. That's for later courses, right? So what I'm about to give you is a super brief summary, but it contains the basic element of truth, the basic structure of that principle, exactly at fundamental what it's telling us. It's telling us a lot more than this, but this is basically as boiled down as we can get it. First principle, specificity, basically says that your training should reflect your needs and your goals, that there's no such thing as great training for everyone, and that the first question you always have to ask in program design is, what is it exactly that we want to achieve? And then the entire rest of your program, bounded by and guided by the principle of specificity, should be tailored to that goal. And if your goal changes, you have to retailor your program. There's no such thing as an all-around amazing program for everyone. Overload, principle number 2, fundamentally says something that I think all of us already know, but when formally stated scientifically, later in these courses, and especially in their application derivatives later when we talk about specific sports, overload is the principle that says that training that makes us the best is going to be progressively challenging, which means not only is it going to be hard, we'll define that later exactly what that means, there's plenty of objective ways to define that, but it's also going to get harder with time, which is a critical element to getting your best progress over the long term. Fatigue management sort of takes specificity and especially overload. Overload says, challenge the system. Fatigue management says, when you challenge the system, 2 things happen. 1, you get better. Fitness is accrued. And 2, you get tired and you get beat up. And parts of cells that are not supposed to be in certain places go in certain places, kind of like a kitchen that gets really dirty and filthy after a whole day of cooking. That kitchen needs cleaning. Just the same way your body needs time, special nutrition, and special training to reduce that level of fatigue that you've built up so that you can once again engage in productive training. So fatigue management tells us, overload tells us about how to train hard. Fatigue management tells us how to recover from that hard training properly so that we can continue to train hard in the future. SRA, stimulus recovery adaptation, is a mouthful of its own principle, basically says that there are sort of 2 rather distinct physiological times for most adaptations. One is the time of training when you're actively disrupting the system and is the stimulus for what the system is going to eventually gain as more ability. And the other time is time of either easier training or rest when those actual gains in ability are realized, right? So it's not the same time. You don't actually get stronger in the gym. You don't, you don't get immediately better at technique right there the first day you learn technique. As a matter of fact, the first day you learn technique, you could be like really confused and someone's like, hey, show me that technique. And you're like, I don't even remember what you're talking about. Later, we know this happens during sleep a lot and during rest and even during light training, those stimuli that you made during the training are actually realized when recovery occurs and when adaptation occurs. So SRA really tells us that training should be at some point in a session, rest session paradigm, that the way we're going to look at all training is not just do stuff and you'll get better. It's do stuff, rest and recover. Adapt, get better, do stuff again, applying the principle of overload, do a bit more, right? So it's session, rest, session, rest, session, rest. Anytime you analyze a training program, it's got to have some pulsatility to it, otherwise just blah stuff all the time, and that can really interfere with progress. Next principle is that of variation. Variation basically tells us that if we do something for way too long and it's the same something, the rate of gains, the return on gains that you get starts to plateau out. Now, it might not completely plateau out, but it might, especially for beginners and advanced, start to assume a curve that is not as high of a slope, so your gains rate can go down. By properly changing some programs, not shocking the body with just random stuff, by strategically varying the kind of training that you're doing or the kind of goal, you can train in one way for a while, and when that starts to work a little less, you can train in another, and train in another, and train in another, and sequence your training so that your training is never too fresh to be too confusing to the body, but never too stale to get you into slowest rate of gain. So variation refreshes your body to continue to make gains at the fastest rates as possible. Phase potentiation is the idea, so it's really a derivative of variation, though it's its own principle because it has so much to say, that the way in which we vary is very important. And what phase potentiation really says is the way in which you do some quality. At some point, if you want this quality, you have to figure out what kind of other qualities buttress and support that quality. And you have to build them first because you want that other quality to have something to stand on, right? So the easiest example is of power, right? Power is the ability to produce force quickly. And we know that speed training brings you up to within very close to your maximal speed. You can make further gains later, but it's very close to maximum within just a couple of weeks of high velocity training. But what power training really, what power abilities really get their most variance from is the force side of the equation, not the velocity, the strength. So someone, if you want to make the most powerful athlete, you have to make them stronger. And we know that just a couple of weeks of strength training doesn't cut it. Strength training is a long-term situation. So if we want the most powerful individual and we want to train them for actual power output, which is very fast, high-velocity stuff, we have to layer before that power training, underneath it, strength training. And the next question is, what is the most fundamental change that happens to the body that allows for strength to increase? And the answer to that is muscularity. The more muscle you have, the more your nervous system can use that muscle to produce force. So now we have a tiered approach where we have a phase of training that builds muscle. Then we take that new muscle and we teach it to be stronger using mostly nervous system alterations. That's a strength phase. And then we get into our power phase where we teach that strong muscle to move fast. And then at the end of that, we're much higher in power than if we either trained for power the entire time, which means we probably wouldn't have gotten as big and strong as we could. We would have trained our velocity pretty well, but that doesn't pay huge dividends because it's a very small change. If we just trained for strength, we wouldn't be as big as possible. We would never get to the highest strength we could, and we wouldn't have the highest net yield of power at the end of that process. And if we just mishmashed everything and trained for everything at the same time, the nervous system doesn't do high power movements super well if you're training it to do a lot of high force movements at the same time, too many perhaps, it's too much fatigue, or especially if you do hypertrophy work, which really just teaches your body how to conserve energy and move more slowly. So if you try to do them all at the same time, you'll get power increases in most people. They'll be like this high, but if you phase potentiate, building on top of the building blocks properly, then you're going to get to the highest possible point. And there's tons of other examples and other analogies from sport. The last principle of training in this quick summary is a principle of individualization. So individualization means that all of the principles should be applied to every single individual. And this is why individualization is a principle we like to list last. Every single individual athlete needs a slightly different amount of each principle to be applied and the way in which it is applied. But it is last because every single athlete needs all of the principles to be their very best. So individualization is a modifier we apply to all principles. For example, somebody is an athlete that can tolerate way more training and still recover and still make gains than someone else. Then the principle of individualization then modifies the principle of fatigue management to say, now we usually manage fatigue pretty aggressively in this particular training situation, but because this athlete has a really good ability to recover, we're going to be less aggressive with fatigue management and more aggressive with overload. So individualization is absolutely a very important training principle, but it simply modifies all of the other ones. No one is exempt. There's not a single person walking around the earth who wouldn't benefit from proper phase potentiation or proper variation, just maybe more or less, or the different way to apply it. Those are the fundamental 7 training principles, and they have their own sub-principles within them. We'll talk about it in the individual courses. Here's the thing. The principles are not all of the same power. They're not all the same power to change how much result you get on your training. And that ranking is from top to bottom. So basically, specificity is by far the most important principle. Overload shortly after. Fatigue management is still super important. SRA and variation are pretty important. And phase potentiation, not super important. And individualization just kind of has to be done. It doesn't explain a lot of the variance in performance. What does that really mean? So it means that specificity is hugely important. It's kind of in its own realm of importance. It almost underlies all the other principles, because if you think of the principles as weapons that shoot better training at a target, specificity is the actual ability to point that weapon at a target. If you shoot all of the best training weapons at marathon running training, but you want it to be a power lifter, you're going to be a really great marathon runner and a shitty powerlifter, because it's the wrong sport. So specificity determines what it is you get better at. All of the other principles determine how much you get better, which is why it's in a league of its own and of preeminent importance. So if you see a program that messes up specificity, you can just stop looking at the program right there and then, because it's going to suck for whatever it is it purports to do. Individualization just modifies the application of the other principles. It doesn't change their fundamentals, right? As human beings, we have much more in common than different. The basic rules of physiological systems are the same. Everyone accumulates fatigue. Everyone requires overload to progress at their best. There's not a single person that can violate the principle of specificity. So all the principles are a little bit more important than individualization. People tend to think, well, I'm super unique. I need my own different approach. Well, it's not very much of a different approach. It's just a little bit of a different approach at the margins. For example, if you wanted bigger or smaller tires on your car, or a steering wheel covered with some kind of covering versus not, nobody would call those huge modifications to a vehicle, but that's kind of the level at which individual difference or individualization is applied to training programs. We'll get into this much more when we get into the principles themselves, but the important thing to remember about the principle rankings is that getting the first couple of principles right is needed for beginners. Even if you don't get them completely right, beginners grow with just any kind of stimulus, but it's very good for beginners. They'll get better progress if you apply the first couple of principles, and is critical for intermediates to get the first couple right. So if you're really screwing up your specificity, if you're really screwing up your overload, if your fatigue management sucks, as an intermediate, you risk not getting any gains at all. But as long as you get those 3 pretty well, SRA and variation, phase potentiation, etc., those principles might not be as important to get completely correct, certainly as a beginner and probably as an intermediate. However, when you're advanced, you've already had a fundamentally good program to get you there, and now the details might start to matter, especially on how fast the gain rates occur. So an advanced person can just be scraping for gains or getting pretty good ones, and they'll be getting pretty good ones more often than not if they apply for sure the beginning principles, but also the latter ones like phase potentiation and a very keen attention to individual difference. So in the grand scheme, this all actually fits in to the concept of periodization. Periodization is defined as the manipulation of training variables to achieve 3 things: increased performance, timed peaking, be as good as you can when you want, and reduced rates of injury. So periodization is the application of all of the principles in a phase potentiated, logically sequenced manner, timed exactly to when you need to be best. And we could have titled this course Elements of Periodization, Fundamentals of Periodization, but it would have been the same thing, because periodization is the method by which all principles are applied. And after this course, you'll know periodization just as well. Folks, Super excited to get into these lectures. See you next time for lecture 2, where we get into specificity and we're going to be real specific about it. My attempt at a joke. It's early. See you guys next time.